Welcome to NAFCO Working Film Title Podcast. I'm your host, Edward Frank. NAFCO is an acronym for the Northern Appalachian Film Collective. We are a 501c3 nonprofit media corporation located in Western Pennsylvania. NAFCO would like to thank its sponsor, West PA Systems, the design-build electrical contractor for your 21st century home and business needs. If you'd like to know more about NAFCO, become a member, or become a sponsor, please visit our website at nafco.org, nafco.org. Our guest today is Patricia Thrushart, who is a award-winning poet and author, and she's going to talk about her writing exploits. Say hello, Patricia.
Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks, Ed.
Well, it's been a few days since I've seen you, and I was wondering in the last week or so if you've published any new books.
Well, as much as I'd like to think that I have that many ideas and that much energy and that much time, no. I do write every day, though, and I definitely have some irons in the fire.
What's your most recent book that you've had published? Tell us about that.
Well, I write in two genres. I write poetry and then I write historical nonfiction. And sometimes even in the nonfiction, I'll write fictional vignettes. So my most recently published book was a collection of poetry. It was called Sanctity, Poems from Northern Appalachia. And the book was written to a large degree in response to, the pandemic and the other stresses that we are experiencing these last, several months. It's a book of healing, and it's a series of poems that celebrate the beautiful woods of Northern Appalachia. So just as nature is healing, just as nature is soothing, so this book was meant to be soothing. The poems are not very long. They're not very difficult to understand. They really reflect the dynamics of the seasons of the forest here. And, I published it and named it Sanctity for all of those reasons. So that's what was last published. Now I'm looking forward to a couple of new things. I do have a book coming out in the fall with Adelaide Books in New York. The book is a historical nonfiction, and it's especially interesting to people who are living around Brookville, Pennsylvania, where close to where I'm based, because it's the story of a woman who was married to a somewhat celebrity here in Brookville. It's the story of Marion Alsabrook Stallman, her life and tragic death. And it will be published, as I said, in the fall by Adelaide Books. And it's a very different sort of book for me. It's my first book of creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction that will be published. So I'm looking forward to it.
So I see you come out on the side of Appalachia as opposed to Appalachia.
Yeah, I was just reading about that. That's so funny you should say that. So supposedly there's some, special line where if you live north of one of it, you're supposed to say Appalachia, and if you live south of it, you say Appalachia. And I know this is a controversy that I hope is mostly in fun. But when I moved up here, honestly, I never really had much occasion to say the word. But when I moved up here outside of Cook Forest and became immersed in the Northern Appalachia community, began identifying as a member of that community, I started saying Appalachia. Do you think that's right? Or what do you think?
I've always said Appalachia, but because it's the Appalachian Mountains as opposed to the Appalachian Mountains. Although I suppose you could say it both ways. It's just something I know that people say different ways in different parts, and it just caught my attention when you were saying it so carefully. You've won a number of prizes and awards for your poetry. Tell us about some of the poetry stuff that you've submitted to and have won.
Well, most of the awards that I've won have been through a couple of different poetry societies, and one is the Pennsylvania Poetry Society. They have a contest every year. It has a number of categories that members and non-members can enter. Many times those categories have themes, or they have requirements about the form the poem must take, the length of the poem, and they have monetary awards associated with them. And then there's also the National Federation of Poetry Societies, which is, the collection of all of those poetry societies across all of the states here in the United States. And they have really quite a comprehensive contest every year with some pretty noticeable, dollar amounts involved. So in 2019, I won the Diamond T Award from the National Federation of State Poet Societies. And it was a $500 award. And I won it with a poem about a cowboy. That was their theme that year, and I had happened to write one, surprisingly. And well, what do you know? It took first place. But I've had a number of other poems place across a number of their categories. I'm waiting right now for the results of the 2021 contest. I think I submitted about 30 poems all told across that many categories. So we'll see what happens.
You're a member of a larger writing community in the local area, and you're, I guess, one of the managers of the Watershed Journal. Tell us about the local writing community.
I'm happy to, because it's such a blessing, to be quite honest. I remember, I think it was Dr. Phil Terman from Clarion University that joked about what in the world is in the water around here that has so many people interested in and writing. I'm the president of the board of the Watershed Journal. I recently was voted into that position. Prior to that, I was serving as secretary, and of course, like you and like many others, I've been a volunteer. So to my view, the Watershed Journal Literary Group is really at the heart of the Brookville literary community. And that's because of three things. Number one, they recently opened a bookstore and literary arts center on Main Street in Brookville. And it's been a wonderful experience. It clearly filled a niche within the larger Brookville area for a bookstore, but it's run by volunteers. The books are donations from our generous community. We get a wide variety of titles and genres. We've gotten some vintage books that have been donated very purposefully. It also has the largest collection of works by regional authors. These are not used, these are on commission. But if you want to learn about the scope of regional authorship in the greater Pennsylvania wilds, the bookstore on Main Street in Brookville is the place to start. And then we also have a literary arts center there. It's a place for writers to gather, to become inspired, to collaborate. Members can use the space for other purposes. I know NAFCO had a little film viewing there, which was delightful. And then we also hold workshops. That's really the third, one of the other legs of the stool, if you will. We hold workshops so the writers in our community can learn more about the craft. And then finally, as I think many of your listeners will know, the Watershed Journal publishes a quarterly literary arts magazine that features photography, artwork, and writing from the storytellers of our region. And it's an inclusive magazine. So while each individual piece is a story and is a voice, the collective voices in the journal really reflect our region. So that's one key component of the community. There's also 3 writers groups functioning in the greater area. Punxsutawney has one, the Stained Glass Writers, and I often go to that. I know you have 2. Writers Block Party operates out of Brookville, but draws from people all over the greater area. And then up in Franklin, there's the Bridge Literary Arts Group. So really a lot of things going on for writers. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Writers Association of Northern Appalachia, or WANA. We are really excited to be partnering with them. They're going to be holding a conference this September in Wheeling, but the membership of that group draws again from our same region, and they're really dedicated to building a canon of works by writers in Northern Appalachia, or Lachia, however you wish.
All the people locally are wondering if you've if you quit beating your poor abused husband every day.
That's right. I mean, he's a poet too. Gerard Tornasol is his pen name, and that means that it's all about writing, all the time around here, which really adds another whole aspect to it that I'm lucky to have.
The Watershed Journal, how often does it come out? And
it's quarterly, and the best way to stay on top of what's going on with the journal is to check in on either their Facebook page or their website, thewatershedjournal.org. So submissions open quarterly, the 2-3 weeks that a writer would have to submit a work. And then decisions are made pretty quickly by the editorial staff, and then we get to work on designing the magazine.
I understand you are applying for some grants to try to get some money to pay for people to help run the bookstore, at least part of the time.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we've been people have poured their hearts and souls and time and books and goodwill and good wishes into the bookstore. But, there's the operating the bookstore and really publishing the journal really falls disproportionately on a couple of shoulders, particularly Jess Weibel and Sarah Rossi, both of whom really are at the heart of what we've been discussing. And there comes a point when, and I feel this very keenly as the president of the board, there comes a point when you really do have to look for opportunities to have staff and pay that staff. That is in the best interests of all of these not-for-profit efforts I've just been describing, because that's what makes those efforts sustainable. You can't have these things happening based on individual heroics. People burn out, people move, people's lives change. So I really do believe that making some of these functions, staff functions with some remuneration, is an important part of the future of the literary group and its efforts.
You've worked to help review and edit some of the other people's works recently. Tell us about your some of your editorial efforts.
Well, I'm not sure I'm really qualified to be called an editor. I mean, I always admire people who have that kind of eye. I'd call myself a beta reader, and we all need them. It doesn't matter how many books you've written or how much experience you have or how much education you have. When it comes to your own work, a fresh pair of eyes, they're just so important. So I have been the beta reader for a number of people in the writers groups that I mentioned. It's always really a lot of fun to contribute to those efforts. People are always very grateful. I know I'm very grateful to my beta readers, and sometimes I'll catch where a narrative is just not working, and they'll catch that for me. When you're a beta reader, you certainly can note where something is misspelled, or where a punctuation is missing, or where a sentence is a little bit clunky. But what you're really doing is trying to provide the writer with a reader's perspective, how readers are responding to it. Because in the writer's mind, they know the story, they understand the flow, and their brain can play tricks on them and fill in the blanks. When a reader starts to go through the work, those blanks are blank. So those are the kinds of things that come out with beta readers. And I know my work has been much benefited from it, and I enjoy doing it when my time allows for others.
In your writing process, you said you write every day. So do these poems, do they just come to you? Do you struggle line by line to write them? How does your whole writing process work?
Well, poems do just come to me, as you're saying. They're my emotional response to my world. Many times I'll write a poem in response to the physical beauty outside my window, the hemlocks, or the deer, or the rain, or whatever it is that just has taken my breath away. The change of seasons, like we're going through now. Sometimes poetry wells up in me in response to other emotions, like maybe what's happened in our country, or in response to something someone has posted or something I've read, even another poem. So poetry is always there for me, and when it wants to come out, it comes out. If I'm driving, I have to dictate into my phone. If it's the middle of the night, I have to wake up, and luckily my husband's a heavy sleeper. I can write it down. Nonfiction's different. Nonfiction takes research, and I probably spend more time in some cases researching than writing. It's amazing, hours of research can result in 2 paragraphs of writing, but it's so critical. And then I also do a lot of revision. I do count that as writing, because it's applying the craft to your first draft, your second draft, taking into consideration the feedback from your beta readers, and any peer reviews you might have asked for. And so I do count revision very much as part of the craft. So like I said, poetry comes unbidden and cannot be denied. And nonfiction is a process that starts with research, and one thing leads to another.
As part of a poetry community, so to speak, how do you see poetry as having changed over your lifetime, and how is it changing now, and in what ways, in what direction is it heading?
That's a great question. And I do believe we are seeing a shift. I think poetry became irrelevant for a long time in our culture anyway, in the US. It got a reputation for being, sort of ivory tower, maybe a little too pretentious. There was this drift away from form and rhyme into free verse, and there was this shift into what some very layered meaning, if very sometimes very obtuse writing. And I think a lot of people wrote poetry off as something you needed a master's degree to understand, that was really only for academia. And of course I'm speaking in gross generalities, but a few things have changed. One big change is performance poetry, where it's almost like rap and poetry became infused, and people began standing up and performing their poetry in an extremely dynamic way. And so people started listening to poetry and coming back to poetry. And poetry, I've seen it become, the megaphone for a number of social issues. And I think the culmination of that was the reading of the poem at Joe Biden's inauguration, just a phenomenal performance by Gorman. And suddenly poetry is in the mainstream again. You also have Instagram poets, and there's some debate about you know um, how they're impacting the genre generally, but you have poets like Kaur who have millions of followers, and her first book, Milk and Honey, sold something like 2.8 million copies. I mean, just a phenomenal change in how poetry is now much more part of the mainstream. For me, I wrote no matter what. I started writing poetry as a teenager. It was an outlet for me as I went through all the typical teenage things, emotions being very heightened, and I never stopped. It never mattered to me whether anyone was going to read it or liked it or anything. But I'm loving the fact that there are thousands of poetry journals to submit to. I would say poetry presses are out there to publish, and it's never going to be the same as science fiction or romance or some of the other really mainstream genres, but it certainly, in my view, has become way more relevant to many, many more people. Does that make sense?
I think the first really prominent person who was a poet that I remember, a concurrent poet, was when Maya Angelou was out writing. Yes. And before that, I don't remember even thinking about any living poets. I'd read things like Coleridge and Poe and Whitman and stuff like that. But the current poets I didn't pay any attention to Maya Angelou.
Yeah. Oh, and what a voice, and what a story. And she was also, I believe, Poet Laureate of the United States. And that's a very important role to keep poetry relevant on the national stage. So today we have the Youth Poet Laureate I already mentioned, Amanda Gorman, who read her poem at Biden's inauguration, and then you have Joy Harjo as our U.S. Poet Laureate, her second year, and she is a Native American, and the Native American experience drenches her poetry. I have her book, The American Sunset, I think that's the name of it, or Sunrise, I can forget which one, but it's all about the story of the Trail of Tears and how it impacted her very family. So Maya, Joy, Amanda, these voices that have been our poet laureates and really have stayed at the center of our understanding of ourselves from a literary perspective have been so important. I love all three of them.
The poetry seems to tend to have a more liberal political flavor than you see in the general countryside around here. Do you think that poetry is a political tool or a political expression as well as an artistic one?
Oh, I think certainly for some authors, absolutely. Some poets, they're writing about social issues, absolutely. But others are writing about love, and others are writing about loss and grief. I mean, when you really narrow it down, poetry is emotion. It's using that particular craft to capture emotion. When you read a poem doesn't start from a place of emotion, which might be anger at a political situation, bemusement over a political position. Sure, if it's without emotion, it's sterile. It comes across that way. And in our community, I mean, we run the gamut. We have a diverse group of writers. Not everyone is cut out of the same cloth, but they're writing about, like I said, they're writing about love. They're writing about the human condition. They're writing about loss, grief, the kinds of emotion that poetry handles so well.
All right, do the poets who write in free verse and the poets who write in rhyme, do they have like these cage matches where they wrestle and fight to be in?
Oh, that's a funny question. Yeah, my view is every decision a poet makes should be a deliberate one. And whatever a poet chooses, whether it's free verse or blank verse or a sonnet or an abecedarian or a villanelle, and whether a poet rhymes or not, that should all be a holistic decision about what they're conveying. Just like if I were an artist and I have the choice of pastels and watercolor and oils and, I don't know, ink, I have an image in my head. I'm going to pick the medium that works for that image. So I would argue that.
So I would argue that any poet should have any element of the craft available to him or her, and that what should drive what he or she chooses is the meaning, the emotion, what he or she is trying to convey. So I have written blank verse, I've written free verse. I have been experimenting. It's funny you should ask this. I've been experimenting with a couple of other forms. And I realized that I really should explore forms more because they're all about enhancing the craft. It's like if you were a potter, you may love most working with one medium and one type of firing, but to be a real diverse potter, you should know ceramics and you should know this kind of kiln and that kind of glaze. It's an art form.
I was just curious about that because if you said about artists working in different mediums, and artists tend to produce almost all their work in one medium. For like Perry Winkler, for example, he studied under a pretty famous oil painter, and he discovered he loved watercolors, and he's done watercolors ever since. So do poets have a form? You talk about experimenting with different structures of the poetry. Do you think that some poets choose one form over another because they find that's the medium that tends to best express themselves, the form that they tend to express themselves the best doing?
I do. I think so. I most poets today, and of course, I'm not studying poetry like a professor of English at a university might, so they can argue. They can certainly argue with me. But I think most of the poets I read today are writing free verse. I think free verse gives the poet the maximum flexibility. When you start to write in a form, you have some real restrictions. What lines should rhyme, how many beats should be in each line, depending on what form you've chosen. There's some definite restrictions, and while it hones your craft to write beautiful lines within that structure, it isn't freeing in the same way that free verse is. So I think most poets that I read today write in free verse, and free verse is expansive enough to embrace the thoughts that poet has, or the ideas that poet has. But I think many of the poets I read have experimented with other forms. Someone like Elizabeth Bishop is a great example. She wrote not just free verse, but she wrote villanelles. She wrote a sestina, which is often held up as the best example of a sestina, which is a darn hard form to write. but what's most important is every one of those poems is absolutely gorgeous.
Philosophically, then the free verse gives you the greatest freedom to do what you want.
It does. It
I,
does.
I see in arguments a lot of times in photography and even in videography about how people place limits on what they're doing because struggling with the limits, either by limiting their equipment or limiting their subjects or a particular theme, that by pushing the boundaries against those limits, they feel they're more creative than they are by just going out and shooting anything. Like Galen Rowell, for example, was a world-class nature photographer, and he did a series for National Geographic where he went out and he limited himself to take one photograph per day. You know, of all the photographs he could go out there, rather than just shooting zap, zap, zap all over the place, he limited himself to one photograph per day. Some filmmakers embrace like shooting on 8mm film because they like the way it looks and and embrace the limitations of the form. And I was just thinking about the context within poetry of embracing a particular difficult structure and how that would affect your creativity or as opposed to not having a structure where you're more free to write what you want. It's an interesting idea, I think, to how does a structure affect your creativity?
It is. It's a very interesting idea. And I feel, in my view, certainly you start with the reason you choose a structure. The structure should enhance, the evocative of the evocative meaning of the poem. So, so there may be topics or there may be feelings that a sonnet enhances, and then there may be other topics or feelings that a sonnet would not enhance, and so you wouldn't write a sonnet for that second type of feeling or meaning any more than you would use watercolor to paint, I think, a highly detailed canvas that you want to almost look like a photograph. It's just not the nature of watercolor. So so what I feel when I decide to write in a form is the form challenges me. And I think this is what you're getting at. The form challenges me to, to write within its restrictions and hone in on the exact right word or combination of words to bring my meaning to fruition. And rhyme is an interesting challenge because rhymes can sound sing-songy, they can be predictable, and so one other challenge of writing in a form that has rhyme is to come up with words that rhyme or and yet are not predictable or look like you only wrote that because you needed a rhyme. So I do think writing in form hones the craft, and I notice after I've written in a played with a form, written in a form, when I go back to free verse, I'm that much more conscious of the choices I'm making, even in free verse.
You were writing poetry in high school, and I imagine you had some poetry classes in college. When did you develop your appreciation for the genre aside from just your playing it, writing it in high school? When did you start to appreciate poetry for the complexities that are involved?
Yeah. I think it really all starts with just loving language. I love to read. I read far more than almost anything else. And when I wasn't reading, I was playing the guitar and singing lyrics. So that's just poetry, you know, set to music. Talk about form and rhyme. So it really all starts with being a reader and loving language. And I didn't start with poetry necessarily. You know, I was reading a lot of fiction, you know, as a middle schooler, a lot of British fiction in particular. Like, you know, I read Jane Austen a lot as a middle schooler. So I think it started with a love of language. And then when you love language, poetry is like dessert, you know. And you know, because it's so distilled, you know, it's so, you know, every word is it has a concentrated role in the piece. So I think I came to poetry later, and I think it really just came out of my love of language in general and my love of song lyrics. So probably in my 20s, especially in college. So I went to the University of Pittsburgh as an undergrad. Well, I ended up there. I started at Carnegie Mellon, but didn't like it for the humanities and moved to Pitt. And I had a wonderful teacher. And it was, his name was Tobin, Professor Tobin. And he was an actor as well as an English professor. And he could read poetry like I've never heard. And it was me first hearing him read the 19th century romantics. Actually, it was me first hearing him read on looking in Homer's or in Chapman's Homer that I fell in love with poetry. I can actually just put my finger on the precise moment. And it was thanks to him.
So, what projects are you currently working on? Are you coming out with a poetry rap album anytime soon?
No, you know, I really admire the people who do performance poetry. I really do. And I love listening to them and watching them. I'd be lucky if I could memorize the first 3 lines of any poem well enough to do that. But as far as poetry goes, I have a couple of things in the queue. I have a manuscript that I believe, you know, that I expect to be published. I have a commitment from a small press to publish it. And it is a manuscript of poems based on the witness of abolitionists during the Underground Railroad. It's called Inspired by Their Voices. So I'm working on getting that all finalized, and we'll see what happens with that. I also have another manuscript, which is called Goddesses I Have Known. And this is a manuscript of poems that explore the feminine, all different aspects of the feminine experience. A lot of these goddesses really aren't that what we think of as feminine, which I love. So that manuscript's been through a developmental edit. I'm incorporating those recommended changes. I'm adding some poems. I'm having a lot of fun with this project. And then, you know, I'll decide how I want to get it out into the world. And then my nonfiction project right now is really a ton of fun for me. It's another book about a woman. She was born in 1865 to a well-connected family in Philadelphia. And, you know, she was their only daughter, and she was the only grandchild of a wealthy family. And there are ties to Pittsburgh, which makes it even more fun for me. Her grandfather was a prominent attorney in Pittsburgh. Her aunt married an iron manufacturer and never had children and was extremely wealthy. And so this girl was, you know, the heiress of this family. And she was very good looking, uncommonly good looking. She had a killer wardrobe. She went to Wilson College as a 14-year-old and later went to Vassar for 2 years. So she was extremely well educated for that time. Then her family moved to Chicago, just as labor unrest was heating up even more, agitation for the 8-hour workday. And what does she do but get involved with anarchists? specifically the Chicago anarchists, which was a group of 8 men who were rounded up after a bomb was thrown during a workers' rally and accused of murder. So her life changed materially, and the life of her family. And boy, oh boy, it's an incredible story. So I'm having a lot of fun writing that.
Sounds like parallels with Patty Hurst and the Symbionese Liberation Army in California.
Yeah, well, she wasn't captured and held, and she didn't, it's
So,
interesting that what got her, what made her get involved. I think she fell in love. She fell in love with the lead anarchist. He was young, he was 32, he was good looking, he was German, but bilingual. He was an editor, he was quite the speaker. He had a charisma about him, and I think she fell in love with him.
I guess I'll end the interview. If you, is any final words, acknowledgments to your dog family there, or anything like that?
Well, um, I try to keep my dogs out of my poetry, just because. Come on, how much how much can you read about dogs? But
Well,
those of us who love them, love them.
I don't know. Peggy Zortman's had books about her dogs, so
That's true. That's very true. Well, her dog is a little bit more of an active dog than some of mine, but I'd say my final words would be, thank you to you. Thank you for having me and some of the other, folks that you're talking about. I think this collaboration between groups like NAVCO and the Watershed Journal are really important because no one group really can survive on its own. It takes this collaboration, and that really is what brings the whole notion of our creative community to fruition. And you mentioned you mentioned Perry Winkler and the Winkler Gallery. We've done collaborations with them, and I think there's many more. So I'm excited about those possibilities, and I believe they'll enrich our community.
all right. Thank you, Patricia. I'll talk to you later. This has been a NAFCO Working Film Title podcast. If you want to listen to the podcast, it is available on Anchor FM, as well as a number of other podcast sites. See our webpage for specific links. NAFCO is an acronym for the Northern Appalachian Film Collective. We are a 501c3 nonprofit media corporation located in Western Pennsylvania. NAFCO would like to thank its sponsor, West PA Systems, the design, build, electrical contractor for your 21st century home and business needs. If you'd like to know more about NAFCO, become a member, or become a sponsor, please visit our website at nafco.org, nafco.org. NAFCO is an acronym for the Northern Appalachian Film Collective. We are a 501c3 nonprofit media corporation located in Western Pennsylvania. NAFCO would like to thank its sponsor, West PA Systems, the design, build, electrical contractor for your 21st century home and business needs.